Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 7, Climate Science. This is video number 26, it's our penultimate video and it's on alternative energy sources. In this video, our intention is to evaluate scientific evidence for the usefulness of a range of mitigation and adaptation strategies as we have been doing, but this time to focus on alternative energy sources. So of all the areas that we've looked at up to this point in climate science, this is probably the one that you maybe know the most about, and that is the difference between renewable and non-renewable energy sources. And the most likely way that we're going to affect the enhanced greenhouse effect is to change the way that humans get their energy. This is not only something that is important in the study of climate science, it's also something that's been, or it certainly had an impact in our recent federal election. People are very concerned about energy generation, not just from the perspective of the climate, but also from the perspective of the economy and how we're going to be able to sustain renewable energy sources. When we look around the world, we already see that large-scale wind and solar projects are in place in many parts of the world, with many countries taking on the challenges of being able to expand their use of renewable energy sources. There's a range of different types of strategies that don't rely on fossil fuels, so that if we can look at the cutting back on our reliance on fossil fuels, particularly coal power and petroleum, then we're going to be able to make a significant impact in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases which have been accumulating in the atmosphere, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. So what are the alternatives? Well, this is going to be a very long video if I talk about each of the alternatives individually, so I'm not going to do that. And I think one of the things that's important is for you to make some brief notes about each of these different areas. I would hope that you're familiar with most of these already. And what's important is that when you look at each of these alternatives, that you think about ways in which they might be useful or applied in your own local area, the way they might be applied in our state and national levels, but also what's actually already happening. What are some of the changes that we can already see? Nice little graphic here, and this is one of these interesting sorts of graphics that has information that you kind of need to process. So there's quite a involved key here for us to try and identify which of these different types of energy sources are important as we're looking forward into the future. You can see, if nothing much else, that we've got that grey area at the bottom of this graph, which is representative of coal and then gas above that. And so those are the ones that are dominating currently, but have been falling since we've sort of started looking at these sorts of analyses. And hopefully they're going to continue on that downward trend. What you can find, when I just look at this graph, I can see that the green and the yellow tend to be the ones that dominate out into the future. And we're talking onshore wind and solar as the two main types of renewable power generation. So wind power and solar power, which in a country like Australia with so much coastline and also so much land that gets high exposure to sunlight, those two forms of renewable energy really do make sense. So solar power is the one that's pretty much at the top of our list. Great option for us. We know that solar power is actually increasing in its uptake. Solar panels on roofs are becoming quite common, and so we're seeing a lot of people take advantage of some of the subsidies too that have been offered for people to switch to at least some portion of their electricity generation through solar energy. Nuclear power is something that at the moment is a bipartisan agreement from both of the major parties that we will not use nuclear power for our electricity generation in this country. We do sell a lot of uranium to countries that do, but nuclear power is not something at this stage that either of the major parties at states or federal levels have gone down that track. Hydroelectric, of course, is something that we've encompassed, and certainly the Snowy Mountains scheme is one good example of where hydroelectricity is being used. Wave energy, again, that ties in nicely with our coastlines and the fact that there is a lot of tidal movement and a lot of wave energy, especially during the big storms. And so there's, I guess, some sort of tie-in between wave energy and tidal movements, movement of water going in and out with that cyclical tidal motions that we see. Biofuels and biomass energy, slightly different. Biofuels are fuel sources that have come from living things. So, for example, through fermentation of sugars in order to produce something like ethanol, and therefore sourcing fuels that way, or perhaps the burning of timber, for example, which is a biomass energy source. Now, of course, we don't really want to do a lot of timber burning. We don't want to burn a lot of wood because that's going to reverse some of those really important sinks for carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Natural gas is cleaner. I guess it's at least burns a little bit lower in terms of the side products or byproducts that are a result of sometimes material that might be present in coal, for example. Not quite to the same extent with natural gas, although it still is one that contributes significantly to greenhouse gas buildup. Geothermal is another area where we're looking at that heat, geo-earth, thermal heat, so heat from within the earth. Another place that we're looking at in terms of whether or not that has potential to be used as an alternate energy source. I've talked about wind power as one that is really coming on, and again with the fact that we're located so close to the coast with the winds coming onshore or even offshore winds blowing the other way, that we get a lot of value out of some of these wind turbines. I think there's a lot of countries that do it a lot better than Australia does at this point in time. Certainly travelling a couple of years ago through Greece, saw a fantastic range of wind power generators that were already set up on a lot of the hillsides and really were well ahead of the game at that point. We are also investigating hydrogen fuel. The thing with hydrogen fuel is it burns with absolutely zero carbon dioxide, because when you combine oxygen, you form water. Now, water, we have said, is also a greenhouse gas that can be a bit of a problem. The other problem with hydrogen fuel at the moment is the easiest way to get it is through electrolysis. And one of the problems with electrolysis is requires energy. So you've got to put energy in order to get the fuel to get the energy back out again. And this is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of talk around carbon neutral types of processes, because it may well be at the end of the process that we're able to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. But in order to get to that end process, maybe there are other things along the way. This is particularly true of something like biofuels. Great to be able to ferment sugars that are present in plants. A lot of that happened with some of the crops in Brazil, for example, where a lot of sugarcane was being turned into ethanol to run ethanol-powered cars. They had to be designed specifically to run with those high levels of ethanol. We haven't done the same thing in this country. We've had E10 for probably about 30 years, and we haven't had the demand for our engines to be able to be sufficiently modified to run with much more ethanol in the petrol than that. The problem, of course, with those sorts of fuels is there's still some energy which potentially can come from fossil fuel sources just to grow the crops, to harvest the crops, and then to go through that fermentation process in order to extract the ethanol at the end. So this is where we've got to look at the entire sequence, the entire chemical process, in order to determine to what extent we are actually using or producing greenhouse gases through the process, even if we might be saving some at the end. As I said, I hope alternative fuel sources and alternative energy sources is something with which you're already a little familiar, and something that certainly we can pick at and have a look at a couple of little more detailed and depth studies when we get into class. Thanks for watching.